Before the Knights Templar carved their mark into the stone of medieval history, the world that gave rise to them was already a place of deep tension and sweeping change. To understand their origins, one must first walk through the landscape of Europe and the Near East at the close of the 11th century, a time of faith, fragmentation, and fire. Western Europe was a realm of feudal bonds and sacred authority. Kingdoms stretched across the land, yet true power rested less with kings than with the great nobles, whose loyalties often lay closer to their own swords than to any crown. Lords held their territories through the service of vassals, bound by oaths of protection and allegiance. Life was local, often harsh, and marked by endless disputes over land and lineage. Above this tangle of allegiances stood the Church, not merely a spiritual institution, but the greatest unifying force in the Christian world. The Pope claimed authority over souls and sovereigns alike. Reforms had been sweeping through the Church in the previous century, strengthening the papacy and its independence from secular rulers. Yet, this had not ended conflict, it had only changed its nature. Kings and popes now wrestled for supremacy in matters of faith and governance, and Europe had become a continent in search of order. Beyond its borders, across the blue waters of the Mediterranean, stood the grandeur of the Islamic world, refined, scholarly, and formidable. The cities of Baghdad, Cairo, and Cordoba glittered with knowledge and wealth. Muslim scholars preserved the ancient wisdom of Greece and Rome and added their own discoveries in science, medicine, and philosophy. Islamic culture at that time was, in many ways, more advanced than its Christian counterpart. But even here, divisions ran deep. The Fatimid Caliphate ruled in Egypt, while the Seljuk Turks, fierce warriors and recent converts to Islam, were expanding their territory through conquest. Their advance into Asia Minor and the crushing of Byzantine forces at Manzikert in 1071 alarmed both Constantinople and Rome. The balance of power was shifting. In the midst of this, Jerusalem remained a sacred city, a spiritual heart for Jews, Christians, and Muslims alike. For centuries, Christian pilgrims had made long and dangerous journeys to the Holy Land, driven by devotion and the promise of grace. But now, the path was threatened by war and unrest. It was in this climate of religious passion and rising peril that the idea of a holy war, a crusade, began to take hold. In 1095, Pope Urban II stood before a crowd at Clermont and called on Christian warriors to take up arms not against each other, but against the enemies of Christendom. God wills it, the cry went up, a cry that would echo for generations. Tens of thousands responded. Some were nobles seeking glory or land. Others were peasants, drawn by visions of paradise or tales of ancient relics. Together they marched east, crossing continents to liberate the land where Christ had walked. The First Crusade was brutal. Jerusalem was taken in 1099, its capture accompanied by scenes of horror that even chroniclers struggled to recount without shudder. But out of the bloodshed came something new, a Christian kingdom carved into the heart of the Muslim world, ruled by Western knights but surrounded by enemies. It was in this fragile outpost, a land sacred yet perilous, that the seed of the Templar order would soon take root. In the year 1119, as the Kingdom of Jerusalem struggled to hold its ground amid the ever-present threats from surrounding forces, a quiet yet fateful event took place. It would go unnoticed by many at first, yet it would echo across centuries. A French knight named Hugues de Payens, along with 8 companions, approached King Baldwin II with a vision both daring and devout, to form a new kind of brotherhood, one that would unite the sword and the cross. These men were not seeking wealth or titles. They asked for permission to live as a monastic community within the Holy City, taking vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. But unlike the monks cloistered in abbeys across Europe, their mission was not contemplation but protection. They sought to guard the pilgrims who, inspired by religious fervor, still came to Jerusalem despite the lurking dangers that stalked every road. The king, recognizing both the piety and practicality of their request, granted them quarters on the Temple Mount, believed by Christians to be the site of the ancient Temple of Solomon. It was from this sacred foundation that the group would take its name, the Poor Fellow Soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon. Their early years were marked by austerity. They owned little. In their seal, 2 knights rode a single horse, a symbol of both humility and brotherhood. Yet even in those modest beginnings, something powerful stirred. For this was not simply another monastic order. It was a new ideal, the warrior monk. At a time when most saw warfare as a worldly pursuit, these knights claimed it as a holy vocation. Their cause was protection, their enemy lawlessness. In guarding the faithful on their journey, they saw themselves as instruments of divine justice. Still, many in both church and nobility viewed them with caution. How could men who bore arms, who killed, even in defense, be called monks? Was not violence the very thing monastic life renounced? The answer would come, in time, through a powerful alliance. One of the knights, André de Montbard, was uncle to Bernard of Clairvaux, a man already renowned for his sanctity and wisdom, and one of the leading voices of the Cistercian reform. Bernard saw in the fledgling brotherhood a reflection of the spiritual struggle, a war not only of flesh but of spirit. He became their champion. In 1129, at the Council of Troyes, the Church formally recognized the order. With Bernard's guidance, they received a written rule, a code of conduct blending monastic discipline with military purpose. The white mantle, a symbol of purity, was officially adopted. Later, the Red Cross was added, a mark of sacrifice and willingness to die in defense of the faith. From these beginnings, a new force emerged. The Templars were no longer simply guardians of roads. They were an idea, a fusion of prayer and war, cloister and crusade. And soon, the world would take notice. With the official blessing of the Church and the support of Bernard of Clairvaux, the Templars began their transformation from a modest company of 9 to an institution that would soon span Christendom. Yet their rise was not sudden. It was forged in the heat of necessity, born of the hardships faced by the Crusader states, and of the order's quiet efficiency in addressing them. The Kingdom of Jerusalem, despite its sacred stature, was a fragile creation. It existed not as a unified nation but as a patchwork of feudal holdings stretched along the eastern Mediterranean. Its rulers depended heavily on reinforcements and support from the west, yet these came sporadically. Meanwhile, the roads between the coast and Jerusalem remained treacherous, the countryside often lawless. Into this environment the Templars stepped with resolve. They patrolled the perilous highways from Jaffa to the Holy City, escorting pilgrims and merchant caravans alike. Their presence, mounted and vigilant, brought a new measure of safety. Word spread quickly among travelers and clergy. The White Cloak brothers were not only brave, but disciplined, incorruptible, and loyal. As the order's reputation grew, so did its ranks. Knights and nobles from across Europe, many of them younger sons with no inheritance to claim, took vows and joined the cause. Their motives were mixed: faith, adventure, penance, perhaps even the hope of glory, but under the Templar rule, personal ambition was bent toward collective purpose. Land began to flow into their possession, first in the Latin East, then across France, England, and beyond. Kings and barons, impressed by their piety and usefulness, granted the order estates, vineyards, mills, and rights to tolls. These gifts were not merely symbolic. They created the backbone of a system that could sustain warriors overseas and provide a steady stream of resources for the defense of the Holy Land. In the political world of Outremer, the land beyond the sea, the Templars became more than soldiers. They were advisors, diplomats, and often arbiters between competing lords. Their neutrality, ensured by their direct allegiance to the Pope, allowed them to serve where others could not. Yet their growing power also drew them into the complex web of Eastern politics. They formed alliances, held castles on behalf of kings, and participated in battles not only against Muslim foes but also during disputes among Christian factions. Still, it was their resolve that remained their defining trait. They stood firm when others faltered. In siege or ambush, they were often the last to retreat, if they retreated at all. Muslim chroniclers, though enemies, spoke of the Templars with respect, even admiration. Their courage was real. Their discipline, unyielding. By the middle of the 12th century, the Templars had become indispensable to the Christian East. Their red cross flew from towers and battlements across the Levant. Their patrols kept the roads open. Their fortresses stood as bastions of Christian rule amid an uncertain sea. What had begun with 9 knights in a corner of Jerusalem had become an institution rooted in every major Christian kingdom, an order bound not by borders, but by faith and a shared mission. But with power comes peril. And in the next chapter of their story, the line between holy purpose and political ambition would become harder to draw. At the heart of the Templar Order's enduring strength was not only their battlefield prowess, but the code by which they lived, a rule that shaped them into a brotherhood unlike any other in medieval Europe. Drafted with care and spiritual insight, it transformed their identity from a gathering of militant monks into a disciplined international force. The rule of the Temple, first formalized at the Council of Troyes in 1129, drew inspiration from older monastic traditions, particularly the Cistercians, but was adapted for a very different mission. The Templar was not cloistered in quiet contemplation. His monastery was the battlefield. His prayers were offered in armor. Each day was structured with precision. The brothers awoke before dawn, answering the call to matins, the first of several daily prayers. Mass followed, then training or assigned duties. Meals were taken in silence, often accompanied by readings of sacred texts. Conversations were limited, idle talk discouraged. Their life was one of restraint, in speech, in appetite, in desire. The rule demanded obedience, not only to God, but to the order itself. Decisions were made by chapter meetings, yet authority rested with the Grand Master and the officers beneath him. A strict hierarchy governed every commandery, from the castles of the Holy Land to the estates of France and England. Knights took vows of poverty, yet the order itself could hold vast wealth, and it did. Personal belongings were forbidden. Horses, armor, and clothing were issued by the order, standardized and communal. Even gifts from relatives required approval. To join the Templars was to surrender oneself entirely to the mission. Their appearance reflected this ethos. The white mantle, simple, unstained, marked full knights. The red cross, added in later years, signified their readiness to shed blood in sacrifice. Beards were required, long hair was cut short. Cleanliness was enforced not for vanity, but for health and readiness. They ate no meat except on certain days. They abstained from women, not only from romantic entanglements, but even from the company of their mothers and sisters, whom they could not kiss. This harsh restriction aimed to eliminate all distractions, all temptations. The Templars' soul belonged wholly to God and his cause. Punishments were strict. A brother who spoke out of turn might be ordered to fast. One who disobeyed could be stripped of privileges or publicly humiliated. Serious offenses, cowardice, theft, heresy, meant expulsion. And to be cast out was no small matter. It was not only a loss of title, but of identity. Yet within this structure, the brothers found purpose. Their rule gave meaning to hardship. In a world of shifting loyalties and feudal ambition, the Templars lived by a single standard, no matter the place, no matter the rank. Whether in the deserts of Palestine or the hills of Burgundy, a Templar knight was guided by the same discipline, bound by the same vows. The rule created order amid chaos. And through it, the Templars became not just an order of warriors, but a model of unity, their discipline the steel beneath the mantle. By the middle of the 12th century, the Templar order had begun its steady climb from humble beginnings to the heights of influence and wealth. This ascent was not marked by conquest alone, but by a gradual weaving of the order into the fabric of Christendom, its lands, its politics, and its economy. Much of this rise was built on trust. The Templars had proven their loyalty to church and king alike. Their victories on the field, their care for pilgrims, and their austere reputation earned them not only admiration but support. Nobles across Europe began to donate land, farms, mills, and entire villages to the order. Some gave out of piety. Others hoped to secure spiritual favor for themselves or their ancestors. These gifts were not scattered. They were carefully organized into a growing network of commanderies, local administrative centers where Templar brothers managed resources, trained recruits, and sent prophets eastward to the Crusader states. Each commandery was both a farm and a fortress, a warehouse and a sanctuary. This structure allowed the order to become self-sufficient. Grain from estates in France, wool from England, olives from Spain, all flowed into Templar hands, processed and sold with efficiency that few secular lords could match. The income supported their war efforts in the East, supplied their fortresses, and funded their ever-growing infrastructure. In Paris, they built a great compound known as the Temple, not just a house of warriors, but a treasury, a meeting hall, and a symbol of their place at the heart of royal affairs. Kings themselves began to deposit their wealth in Templar vaults, entrusting these monks with what was dearest to them. In London, another such headquarters rose, the New Temple, close to the seats of power and influence. But it was not only treasure they guarded. The Templars soon found themselves managing entire estates for absent nobles, acting as financial stewards, and lending money in ways that skirted church prohibitions on usury. Their administrative skill, their discipline, and their immunity from local interference made them ideal partners in royal finance. And as the West grew richer, as trade flourished and towns expanded, the Templars stood at the crossroads, managing funds, moving money, and ensuring that Christian armies could march when summoned. Yet even as they grew in power, they remained bound to their core mission, the defense of the Holy Land. In the east, they constructed and manned formidable castles on the frontier. These fortresses, built with precision and care, often formed the last line of defense against advancing Muslim forces. From these heights, Templar knights could monitor valleys, patrol roads, and hold back attacks that might overwhelm lesser outposts. Their discipline on the battlefield, born from years of rigorous training and a code that forbade retreat unless hopelessly outnumbered, made them a force to be reckoned with. They did not boast of their victories. They stood their ground and let their actions speak. By now, the order was more than a military brotherhood. It was a power, economic, political, and spiritual, that few in Christendom could ignore. The world had changed around them, and they had changed with it. From guardians of pilgrims, they had become guardians of kings. Though the image of the Templar knight conjures visions of horse and sword, the order's reach extended beyond land. As the Crusader states became increasingly dependent on supplies from Europe, the Templars turned their eyes to the sea, and soon became formidable mariners in their own right. It was a quiet transformation, born not of ambition, but of necessity. The Holy Land could not survive without constant support from the West. Roads were perilous, but sea lanes, though quicker, were no less dangerous. Pirates haunted the Mediterranean. Muslim fleets patrolled the waters. Merchants risked everything to deliver arms and grain to distant garrisons. The Templars, ever practical, understood that to control the flow of war, they must command the waters that fed it. At the port of Acre, the order established a naval base of growing complexity, shipyards, warehouses, and docks under constant guard. From here, Templar ships began to carry cargo, soldiers, and pilgrims between east and west. Their fleet was not large, but it was efficient, and more importantly, it was theirs. Galleys for coastal patrols. Transports for war horses and supplies. Even dedicated ships for carrying pilgrims safely across the sea. Each vessel flew the red cross of the temple, a symbol that, even on open water, promised protection and resolve. They recruited sailors from the maritime republics, Genoa, Venice, Marseille, men who knew the winds, the stars, and the reefs. These were not knights in shining armor, but seamen bound to the same mission, operating under the order's strict discipline. Templar ships played vital roles during campaigns. At the Siege of Acre during the Third Crusade, Their vessels enforced blockades and delivered siege engines too massive for overland transport. When roads failed, when terrain proved too hostile, the sea became the order's lifeline. Their fleet also ferried kings. When monarchs from Europe answered the call of crusade, they often chose Templar ships for their journey, drawn by their speed and security. Even merchants, though not part of the religious cause, paid handsomely to travel under the cross. The profits were reinvested. Port facilities expanded. Harbors fortified. Navigation systems refined with signal lanterns and coastal guides. The order, always practical, adopted what worked, whether from Greek pilots or Arab cartographers. Yet even at sea, the rule followed them. Chaplains sailed with every crew. Prayers were said at dawn and dusk, even in storm or battle. The Templars did not abandon their vows when waves replaced soil. Their faith remained their compass. This maritime power became increasingly important as the Christian grip on the Holy Land weakened. When fortresses fell, when inland routes became impassable, the sea remained the only thread connecting east and west. The Templar fleet, though never vast, was reliable, disciplined, armed, and utterly devoted. And when the final years of the Crusader states came, it was by sea that survivors fled, often aboard ships bearing the Red Cross. The sea, once a road of conquest, became a path of retreat. But the knowledge they had gained, in navigation, in shipbuilding, in maritime logistics, did not vanish. It would travel westward, especially to Portugal, where echoes of the temple would sail again under a new banner. For now, however, the Templars had become more than knights. They were masters of land and sea, and the Mediterranean itself knew their presence. Among the many transformations that defined the Templar order, none was as unexpected, or as far-reaching, as their role in the birth of European finance. From warriors of faith, they became guardians not only of roads and cities, but of treasure and trust. It began, as much else did, with pilgrims. Traveling to the Holy Land was not only dangerous, but costly. Pilgrims had to carry gold and valuables across thousands of miles, making them easy targets for thieves and brigands. The Templars, already trusted protectors of the way, offered a simple, ingenious solution. A pilgrim could deposit money at a Templar commandery in, say, Paris, and receive a coded letter. Upon reaching Jerusalem, he would present the letter and receive his funds, less a small fee. No coin crossed borders. No purses were stolen. The value moved through the order's vast internal network, guarded by trust and sealed with the Red Cross. This system, humble in origin, soon became essential for merchants, nobles, even kings. For the Templars had something few others could claim, the presence in nearly every Christian land, and a reputation for incorruptibility. Their estates and commanderies stretched from the British Isles to Cyprus, forming a lattice of reliability and discretion. They offered more than safekeeping. The order developed systems for managing estates, collecting rents, and dispersing funds on behalf of absent landowners. When a noble went on crusade, he could leave his lands under Templar care, knowing they would be well managed and his family provided for. Kings, too, came knocking. Monarchs, ever in need of silver to wage war or settle debts, turned to the temple not as a bank in name, but in function. In France, the royal treasury itself was housed in the Templar compound in Paris. The order kept records, guarded jewels, and managed complex transfers that bypassed the slow and uncertain roads of medieval finance. Though bound by church laws that forbade usury, the Templars found ways to lend, through fees, services, and creative arrangements. They became, in effect, the first international bankers of Europe. And their vaults became symbols of both power and mystery. In London, the new temple held royal funds and diplomatic secrets. In Aragon, commanders handled estate income and border duties. In Italy, Templar houses coordinated with merchants from Genoa and Pisa. Everywhere, the order operated with a consistency that rivaled governments and often outperformed them. This role brought prestige, but also risk. As the Templars accumulated wealth, whispers began to rise. Could warrior monks truly remain humble? Were their riches justified by their vows? Some clergy grew uneasy. Rival moneylenders grew resentful. And in royal courts, debt began to curdle into suspicion. Still, through most of the 13th century, the temple stood firm. Their financial systems grew more sophisticated, their records more precise. They used accounting methods that would not become common in Europe for centuries. Coin scales, double ledgers, and sealed chests became part of their daily world. In an age before banks, before central treasuries, before the very idea of institutional finance, the Templars had built a network that carried not just men and weapons, but trust. And in time, that trust would become both their greatest strength and their greatest vulnerability. Behind the gleam of swords and the silence of monasteries lay an engine, a vast, disciplined economy that powered the Templar order across continents. Their castles and banks drew attention, but it was their integrated system of land, labor, and logistics that truly sustained their might. The foundation of their wealth was land, granted by nobles seeking spiritual merit, or kings hoping for the order's protection. These holdings, though scattered across Europe, were anything but random. Each estate, whether vineyard in Aquitaine or pasture in England, was carefully managed, its yields tracked and transported according to need. Templar commanderies functioned like regional headquarters, part monastery, part fortress, and part administrative hub. They supervised tenant farmers, collected rents, processed grain, and stored surplus for lean years. Mills turned by water, oil presses, and wine cellars multiplied the value of what the land provided. Nothing was wasted. Sheep in Spain gave not only meat, but wool for sale. Timber from northern forests became beams for ships or towers. Even salt from coastal flats was harvested and traded. The brothers, though sworn to poverty, directed an economy that was anything but poor. The scale of these operations required more than good intentions. It demanded management, and here the Templars excelled. They kept inventories, maintained ledgers, and enforced standards across all holdings. Visits from central inspectors ensured consistency. A system of internal audits, rare in the medieval world, kept fraud and neglect in check. This discipline extended to their workforce. Though the core of the order was monastic, much of the labor came from laypeople, farmers, craftsmen, and clerks who worked under Templar supervision. They were paid fairly by the standards of the time, and in return were expected to uphold the efficiency that the order demanded. Their economic reach was also strategic. Grain from Burgundy fed knights in the east. Horses bred in the Pyrenees carried Templar riders across Anatolia. Profits from wine and wool in France funded fortresses in Palestine. It was a web of exchange, one that tied Europe to the Levant through a single, relentless institution. Even transportation was under their control. The order maintained stables, wagons, and supply lines across kingdoms. They organized their own convoys, complete with guards and way stations. When needed, they could move supplies faster and more safely than most royal armies. In towns, they held urban properties, inns, workshops, and markets that generated rents and extended their presence into civic life. In ports, they ran warehouses and shipyards, enabling not just commerce, but the movement of armies and pilgrims alike. This economic machine was not an accident. It was the result of a rule that valued order, a leadership that prized planning, and a mission that could not afford to fail. For nearly 2 centuries, the Templar economy functioned with a level of integration and foresight unmatched in Europe. But it also made the order more visible, and more envied. In a world where kings schemed and clergy argued, the Templars stood apart, wealthy, disciplined, and answerable only to the Pope. Their wealth inspired admiration. But it also stoked fear. And in time, that fear would become fatal. Beneath the weight of legend and the armor of discipline, the Templar Knight lived a life that was neither easy nor grand. His days were not filled with triumphs or treasure, but with routine, a rhythm of prayer, labor, and readiness that shaped the soul as much as the sword. To join the order was to enter a world apart. The ceremony of initiation was solemn and secret. A candidate swore eternal obedience, poverty, chastity, and the defense of Christendom. From that moment, he ceased to be an individual. He was now a brother, and the rule would govern every part of his life. His mantle was white, a symbol of purity. The red cross, worn over the heart, marked him as one prepared to die for his faith. His hair was cropped to fit a helmet. His beard, kept full, set him apart from the shaven elegance of courtly knights. Each day began before dawn, with the sound of a bell summoning the brothers to matins. They rose from straw mattresses in communal halls, no private rooms, no personal comforts, and walked silently to chapel for prayers. After Mass, they ate a modest meal, often of bread, vegetables, and water. Meat was allowed only on specific days, and gluttony was a sin. Training followed. Even in times of peace, the Templar prepared for war. Horseback maneuvers, formation drills, swordsmanship, all practiced with intensity and repetition. Discipline was everything. A Templar never broke ranks in battle. He never fought for personal glory. He stood, not as a man, but as part of a brotherhood. The afternoons varied. Some tended to horses and armor. Others oversaw stores or repairs. Those with literacy might manage accounts or write reports to commanders in distant lands. In frontier posts, patrols were constant. Vigilance never ceased. Meals were taken in silence, accompanied by readings of scripture. Conversation was rare and always restrained. The rule forbade idle talk, boasting, or complaints. Recreation was limited to what was necessary for health. There were no tournaments, no hunting for sport, no music or tales of courtly love. Women were forbidden within Templar houses. Even letters from female relatives were discouraged. The knight was to be chaste in body and mind, always watchful against temptation. He was a monk, even if his hands bore a sword. Punishments for breaking the rule were strict. A careless word might earn extra prayers. Neglecting one's equipment could bring public penance. More serious offenses, such as disobedience or cowardice, could mean expulsion, a fate often worse than death for one who had forsaken all for the cause. And yet, many who lived this life did so not in bitterness, but in quiet conviction. To be a Templar was to belong to something greater, a purpose that gave order to suffering and meaning to sacrifice. Letters from surviving members tell of this inner peace. One brother wrote, "Though my body is weary and my food is plain, my heart is at ease. For I serve not for coin, but for the Lord who watches all roads." The temple was more than a fortress. It was a world, austere, devout, and utterly devoted. And within its stone walls, men lived lives that few understood, and fewer could endure. Scattered across the hills and deserts of the Holy Land stood the stone monuments of the Templar Order, fortresses that rose not merely from mortar and rock, but from faith, fear, and the need to endure. These were not palaces of luxury or symbols of royal pride. They were machines of war, built for one purpose, to hold the line where others might break. From the coast of Syria to the valleys of Palestine, Templar castles formed a chain of strongholds that guarded roads, dominated mountain passes, and anchored frontier defense. They were positioned with purpose, always near danger, always between Christendom and the enemy. One of the most formidable was the fortress of Safed, perched atop a ridge overlooking Galilean plains. Rebuilt by the Templars after Muslim forces had razed it, Safed was a testament to both engineering and resolve. Its towers watched every valley, its cisterns collected rain for long sieges, and its walls were thick enough to defy siege engines for weeks, even months. Another was the castle of Bagras in the north, a lonely sentinel near the Amanus Mountains, guarding the passes into Ansh. There, in narrow defiles and shadowed woods, Templar patrols scouted for raiders and reported to commanders who knew that delay could mean survival. The architecture was brutally functional. Concentric walls, hidden stairways, murder holes for boiling oil, every feature designed to resist siege and punish attackers. Bent entrances prevented battering rams from gaining speed. Rounded towers deflected missiles. High windows made archers safer and gave defenders the advantage of height. Yet, within these fortresses, life was not only military. They contained chapels, dormitories, and storage for food and arms. In times of peace, they housed the rhythm of the rule, prayers, maintenance, and constant training. In times of war, they became sanctuaries, not only for Templars, but for pilgrims and peasants who fled behind their gates when danger came. Each castle was a statement, "We are here, and we will not yield." But they were not invincible. As the Muslim states around the Crusader kingdoms united under stronger leaders, most notably Saladin, the castles became targets of sustained siege. Some fell after betrayal, others through hunger and exhaustion. Yet many held longer than any had expected, their garrisons fighting to the end, dying as they had lived, in silence and duty. When the cities fell and the kingdoms crumbled, the Templar castles remained as the last vestiges of resistance. Even in defeat, they did not go quietly. Their stones still echo with the memory of battles fought not only for land, but for belief. Today, many lie in ruins. Time and weather have softened their outlines. But those who walk their halls, now open to sky and wind, can still feel something ancient in the stone. They were not just walls. They were resolve made visible. The Templars were never alone in their mission. As they rose to prominence, other orders emerged with similar vows and goals, some as friends, others as uneasy companions on the same road. Chief among these were the Hospitallers, the Knights of St. John. The Hospitallers had begun, not as warriors, but as caretakers. Their first mission had been to tend to sick and wounded pilgrims in Jerusalem. But as violence persisted, they too took up arms, blending charity with steel. By the middle of the 12th century, they had become a military order in their own right, bearing black mantles with white crosses and defending fortresses alongside the Templars. Together, these two orders formed the backbone of Christian defense in the East. In times of war, they stood side by side at the front. Their garrisons manned the same walls. Their knights charged into battle beneath different banners but with shared purpose. Yet, unity did not always mean harmony. The Templars and Hospitallers, while alike in structure and vow, often found themselves at odds, in politics, in priorities, and especially in influence. Donations given to one were not given to the other. Kings and nobles had to choose whose favor to seek, whose counsel to trust. And in that choice, rivalry was born. Disputes flared over lands, over jurisdiction, even over the control of castles. At times, the tension boiled over into violence, requiring intervention by kings or popes. Still, these conflicts rarely lasted long. Both orders knew the stakes. Division in the face of a common enemy was a luxury they could not afford. Beyond the Hospitallers, other orders emerged, the Teutonic Knights in the Baltic, the Order of Santiago in Iberia. Each adopted parts of the Templar model, blending monastic life with military discipline. Some cooperated closely with the Templars. Others kept their distance. In the courts of Europe, the Templars also engaged with bishops, nobles, and monarchs. Their independence, granted by the Pope, gave them freedom from local interference, but also drew suspicion. They answered to no prince. They paid no taxes. They operated by their own rule, beneath their own flag. For some rulers, this was a blessing. For others, it was a warning. And yet, the Templars often worked hand in hand with kings. In France, England, Aragon, and Hungary, they advised monarchs, managed treasuries, and led armies. Their loyalty was to Christendom as a whole, not to any single throne, and this made them both useful and feared. As their network spread, their alliances multiplied, but so did their list of rivals. Secular lords envied their wealth. Church officials resented their autonomy. And within the order itself, voices sometimes rose in dissent, questioning whether the balance between prayer and power had been lost. Still, the Templars endured. Their armor bore the Red Cross, but their place in Christendom was woven from hundreds of invisible threads, alliances made not just with sword and vow, but with gold, counsel, and unshakable discipline. They were not the only warriors of faith in their age. But they were, perhaps, the most distinct. In the summer of 1187, the fortunes of Christendom in the Holy Land would reach their darkest hour, and the Templars would face a trial that tested the very limits of their valor and resolve. That road led to a windswept rise of land in Galilee, called the Horns of Hattin. By the late 12th century, the balance of power in the Levant had shifted. The Muslim world, once fragmented, now rallied under a single, brilliant commander, Salah ad-Din, known to the West as Saladin. A warrior of discipline and faith, he had united Syria and Egypt under his banner. Where Christian kingdoms squabbled, Saladin prepared. The kingdom of Jerusalem was in disarray. King Guy de Lusignan, inexperienced and mistrusted, had inherited a fragile throne. Factions within the Crusader states argued over policy, alliances, and succession. Amid this political discord, the Templars remained a constant force, warning of danger and urging readiness. Their scouts tracked Saladin's movements. Their knights patrolled vulnerable roads. In early July, word came that Saladin had attacked Tiberias, a fortress held by Raymond of Tripoli's wife. A council was held at Sephoria. The wiser course, argued by Raymond and the master of the Templars, was to remain where water and supplies were plentiful. But pressure from hawkish nobles, and the king's desire to assert his authority, led to a fateful decision. The army marched. Under a blazing sun, the Christian host advanced into the dry plains. Templar knights led the vanguard. They were disciplined, but the land was merciless. Saladin's forces shadowed their march, harassing their lines, cutting off access to wells. Day turned to night without relief. Thirst set in like a sickness. Spirits faltered. By the second day, the army was near collapse. At the Horns of Hattin, two steep hills overlooking the Sea of Galilee, the Christians made a stand. Saladin encircled them. Fires were lit to smoke the exhausted men. Arrows rained down. There was no escape. The final assault was swift and devastating. Weary knights mounted futile charges. Infantry broke. The royal tent was taken. King Guy was captured. The relic of the true cross, carried into battle for divine favor, was seized, a blow not only to morale, but to Christian myth. For the Templars, the defeat was total. Most who survived the battle were executed. Saladin, respecting their martial commitment but seeing them as sworn enemies of Islam, ordered their deaths. Only a few, spared for ransom, returned to tell the tale. The loss at Hattin shattered the Crusader kingdoms. Within months, city after city fell, Acre, Jaffa, Ascalon. And then, the heart of it all, Jerusalem, was surrendered. It was the greatest catastrophe the Templars had ever known. But it did not end them. Instead, they regrouped. From Tyre, from Tripoli, from Cyprus, the order began again. Their castles in the north held. Their fleet brought aid. And soon word of their sacrifice spread across Europe, sparking a new wave of support. They had lost a battle, but not the war. For the Templars, the road to Hattin was not the end. It was the crucible in which their legend, forged in vow and steel, would be tested by fire. In the wake of Hattin and the fall of Jerusalem, the Christian world reeled in shock. News of the disaster swept across Europe, igniting fury, grief, and a deep sense of betrayal. The holy city, the goal of generations of pilgrimage and prayer, was no longer in Christian hands. The Red Cross now flew over the ramparts of Acre, and the minarets of Jerusalem belonged once more to Islam. But from this sorrow came a rallying cry. Pope Gregory VIII issued the bull Audita Tremendi, calling upon the faithful to take up the cross. Monarchs responded. Not lords and barons this time, but kings. The Third Crusade would be led by the mightiest rulers of the age, Frederick Barbarossa of the Holy Roman Empire, Philip Augustus of France, and Richard I of England, remembered forever as Richard the Lionheart. For the Templars, this was not the beginning of a new crusade. It was a continuation of their mission. They had not returned home after Hattin. They had not scattered. In Tyre, they helped defend the last remaining Christian bastions. In Cyprus, they secured new bases. And in Acre, they prepared for the storm that was coming. Richard's arrival in 1191 marked a turning point. Fierce, tireless, and charismatic, the English king understood war as few others did. And he respected the Templars, not only for their courage, but for their experience. He relied on them for counsel, for logistics, and in battle. At the Siege of Acre, the Templars played a decisive role. Their engineers dug trenches. Their ships brought supplies. Their knights joined the assaults that finally forced the garrison to surrender. The city, so long a symbol of Christian loss, was back in Crusader hands. But the road to Jerusalem remained blocked. Saladin's forces, though shaken, were not broken. And the Christian army, though powerful, was riven by tension. Philip of France soon returned home. Frederick had drowned en route, leaving his army rudderless. Only Richard remained, and the Templars stood with him. Together, they marched south, defeating Saladin at Arsuf in a stunning display of discipline and courage. The Templars formed the right wing of the army, holding firm under assault, then driving forward in coordinated charges. Their cohesion and refusal to break were key to victory. Yet Jerusalem proved elusive. Despite gaining ground, Richard hesitated. The city could perhaps be taken, but not held. Its defenses were strong. The surrounding territory was hostile. And without reinforcements, even victory might become a trap. So the army turned back. And in 1192, Richard signed a truce with Saladin. It was not the triumph many had hoped for, but it brought a measure of stability. Christians retained the coast. Pilgrims were allowed access to Jerusalem. And the war, for the moment, subsided. For the Templars, the Third Crusade restored much of their lost stature. They had fought with honor. They had endured the fall and helped to secure the recovery. In Richard, they had found a monarch who respected their mission, and whose trust they had earned in full. Though Jerusalem remained beyond their reach, the Order's resolve did not falter. Their castle stood firm. Their network strengthened. And their cross, still red, still bold, continued to mark them as guardians of faith, of land, and of a hope not yet extinguished. In the aftermath of the Third Crusade, while Jerusalem remained outside Christian hands, a new chapter in Templar history began on an island, distant from the Holy City, but close to the heart of their future. That island was Cyprus. In 1191, as part of his campaign, Richard the Lionheart seized Cyprus from its ruler, Isaac Komnenos, a rogue Byzantine noble who had defied imperial authority. The conquest was swift, and the island, fertile and strategically positioned, fell into English hands. But Richard had no desire to rule Cyprus. His war was in the Levant, and his eyes were fixed on Jerusalem. So, in a transaction both sudden and consequential, he sold the island to the Templars. For the Order, this was a moment of opportunity and trial. Cyprus offered much, a safe harbor for their fleet, lands rich in grain and vineyards, and a stronghold beyond the immediate threat of Muslim counterattack. Yet when the Templars arrived to govern, they found themselves ill-prepared for the task of civilian rule. Their regime was harsh, their discipline ill-suited to local politics. The Cypriots, used to Byzantine customs and resentful of foreign overlords, soon rebelled. Templar garrisons held their ground for a time, but the island seethed with unrest. The brothers, skilled in war but not in governance, were forced to reconsider. Recognizing their limitations, the Order returned Cyprus to Richard, who then passed it to Guy de Lusignan, the former king of Jerusalem. Under Lusignan and his successors, Cyprus became the seat of a new Latin kingdom, one that would long outlast the Crusader states on the mainland. Yet the Templars did not vanish from Cyprus. On the contrary, they remained, as landholders, as fortress builders, and as protectors of the routes between Europe and the East. Their initial failure in government became a strategic shift. Cyprus would not be ruled by them, but it would serve them as a supply base, a staging ground, and a retreat when needed. From their new commanderies, they organized shipments of arms, food, and manpower. Their ships came and went from ports like Limassol and Famagusta. Their presence helped transform the island into a crucial link in the chain of Christian defense. Meanwhile, in the Holy Land, the Templars continued to rebuild. Castles lost were repaired or replaced. New recruits arrived from Europe. Donations flowed again, inspired by the Order's conduct during the Third Crusade. The Red Cross rose once more on towers and gates. Though the dream of retaking Jerusalem had faded, the mission endured. Acre became the de facto capital of the Crusader states. From there, the Templars worked with Hospitallers and other allies to maintain what remained of the Latin East. It was a fragile peace, always under threat. But it held, for now. Cyprus had not become their kingdom, but it had become their anchor. And in the years that followed, it would prove to be the refuge from which their next generation would rise, to fight, to guard, and to endure in a land that seemed always on the edge of flame. The strength of the Templar order did not rest on swords alone. It was written in stone, in the thick walls and silent towers that rose across the Levant and Europe alike. To understand their legacy is to walk the corridors of their castles, where faith met function in every corner. Templar fortresses were not merely shelters. They were strategic instruments, placed with care and shaped by experience. Each one was a response to geography, threat, and purpose, whether perched on a hill above a pilgrimage route or guarding a narrow coastal pass. Their most iconic strongholds bore certain common traits. Concentric walls, rings within rings, formed the outer defense. Square or round towers anchored the corners. Entrances were narrow, twisting paths, designed to slow and expose attackers. Arrow slits, murder holes, battlements, every element had a role. The castles of the East, especially in the Holy Land and Syria, were built to withstand both siege and time. Consider the fortress of Chuz-tel-Blanc, nestled in the hills of Syria. Its layered defenses and commanding views allowed a handful of defenders to hold off larger forces. Or the castle at Tortosa, near the Mediterranean, with its mixture of Templar and Byzantine design, a testament to the order's willingness to adapt and learn from local tradition. Inside these fortresses, life was austere but orderly. There were chapels where brothers gathered for prayer, refectories for meals, dormitories of stone and straw, armories stocked with lances and crossbows, and storerooms filled with grain and salted meat for long sieges. The Templars did not build for comfort. They built to endure. In Europe, the structures differed. There, the castles served as administrative centers, strong, yes, but not always military. Commanderies in France, Spain, and England often included barns, workshops, and markets. The architecture reflected a broader role, collecting rents, managing estates, and hosting travelers and pilgrims. Yet even here, defense was never forgotten. High walls, guarded gates, and central keeps reminded all who entered that the order served both God and vigilance. What made Templar architecture remarkable was not just its strength, but its coherence. Whether in the heat of Palestine or the forests of Burgundy, a Templar site felt familiar. The same discipline that shaped their lives shaped their buildings. Practical, fortified, and sacred, all at once. Their builders drew from many influences: Romanesque arches, Arab cisterns, Byzantine towers, yet they imposed a unity of purpose. The result was a style not of ornament, but of authority. To see a Templar castle on the horizon was to know that the land was watched, and that protection, or resistance, lay within. Today, many of these fortresses remain. Some are ruins, worn by wind and time. Others still stand, their walls weathered but defiant. Tourists walk where warriors once prayed. But the silence is the same. In their architecture, as in their rule, the Templars built not for glory, but for duty. And stone, when shaped by conviction, endures far beyond its age. As the Crusader kingdoms endured the uncertainty of survival, the Templars found themselves drawn deeper into a realm as treacherous as any battlefield, the world of politics. The Kingdom of Jerusalem, though restored in part, was never stable. Its borders shifted constantly, its rulers often short-lived. Power passed not through clear lines, but through marriage alliances, succession disputes, and the uneasy cooperation of competing barons. In such an environment, strength alone was not enough. One had to navigate loyalties, claim, and diplomacy with care. The Templars, bound to no crown and beholden only to the Pope, occupied a unique place in this chessboard. They were both insiders and outsiders, vital to the defense of the realm, yet separate from its feudal entanglements. This gave them a voice in courts and councils, where their presence was often decisive. At royal assemblies, the Grand Master of the Templars sat alongside kings and patriarchs. The order's advice was frequently sought, especially in matters of military campaign, supply logistics, or truce negotiations. They knew the terrain. They knew the enemy. And they were, more than most, untouched by local rivalries. But with influence came risk. The Templars were not immune to faction. Some Grand Masters favored certain rulers or causes. Others resisted what they saw as reckless ambition. During the conflicts between King Guy of Lusignan and Conrad of Montferrat over the crown of Jerusalem, the Templars, like the Hospitallers and Teutonic Knights, were drawn into the dispute, not by desire, but by necessity. Their support could tilt the balance of power. And so, rival claimants often courted them, offering lands, privileges, or promises of future favor. The order treaded carefully, but neutrality was not always possible. Their involvement extended beyond Christian politics. At times, the Templars negotiated directly with Muslim leaders, trading prisoners, arranging truces, or seeking local intelligence. These exchanges, often quiet and pragmatic, were conducted without illusion. Both sides knew that war would resume. But between battles, there was room for reason. Some criticized these dealings as compromises. Others saw them as a sign of maturity, proof that the Templars served not vengeance, but mission. In Europe, too, their political role expanded. As custodians of royal treasuries and guardians of pilgrims, they became fixtures at court. Monarchs consulted them. Nobles entrusted them. Popes leaned on their counsel. And in return, the order maintained its independence, refusing to be a tool of any single throne. Yet their growing power also bred resentment. Secular lords chafed at their tax exemptions. Bishops disliked their autonomy. Rivals whispered that the Templars were too rich, too secretive, too aloof. And in the back rooms of court, envy began to mask itself as righteous concern. For now, the order still stood above such attacks. Their record in battle, their discipline, their global network, all shielded them. But beneath the surface, the seeds of suspicion had begun to root. And in time, those roots would twist toward ruin. From their very beginning, the Templars were forged in the crucible of religious war. But the truth of their encounter with Islam was more complex than the clash of sword and creed. It was a relationship marked by both violence and a strange, reluctant familiarity. The Muslim world the Templars entered was not monolithic. It was diverse, culturally, theologically, and politically. There were Arabs and Turks, Sunnis and Shiites, caliphs and sultans, merchants and mystics. The Templars arrived as invaders, yes, but they did not land upon chaos. They entered civilizations with long traditions, deep roots, and proud histories. At first, understanding was limited. The early Crusaders, including the Templars, saw Islam as heresy, a corruption of Christianity led by false prophets. Muslim chroniclers, in turn, viewed the Franks as crude foreigners, brave but ignorant, powerful but impious. And yet, necessity forced interaction. On the frontiers, the Templars often negotiated truces with Muslim emirs. These agreements, though temporary, required diplomacy and exchange not only of words but of expectations, values, and customs. Envoys crossed lines. Prisoners were ransomed. Gifts were given, and sometimes even friendships, cautious, reserved, were formed. There were moments of respect. Saladin, though he fought the Templars fiercely, spared some after battle when honor allowed it. The Templars, in turn, held a grudging admiration for the discipline and devotion of their Muslim adversaries. Both sides saw in the other a reflection of themselves, warriors bound by faith, prepared to die for what they believed. But make no mistake, the wars were real, and the violence brutal. The Templars took no quarter from Muslim raiders who threatened pilgrims. Their castles were often the first to resist incursions, and the last to fall. When taken prisoner, Templar knights could expect little mercy. Their refusal to renounce the cross, even under torture, was known. And they became symbols, not just of military threat, but of unwavering religious defiance. Muslim chroniclers mention them by name. In texts from Damascus to Cairo, the Temple Knights are feared and respected, known for their courage, their skill, and their silence. They were often described as the most determined of all the Franks. Yet even in the fury of war, a strange order existed. Battle was followed by burial. Sieges by exchange. Codes were followed. Ambassadors were honored. And the longer the wars went on, the more the two civilizations, though opposed, came to know one another. In the marketplaces of Acre and Tyre, Arabic was spoken as often as French. Templars learned the habits of their foes, how they fought, how they prayed, how they governed. Some even studied their texts, translated into Latin by scholars in Spain and Sicily. Not to agree, but to understand. Thus, while the Templar mission remained unshaken, to defend Christendom and resist the advance of Islam, their world was not one of blind hatred. It was one of confrontation, yes, but also of contact. In the end, the Templars stood not only at the edge of Christendom, but at its meeting point with another great civilization. And what they saw there, in the eyes of their adversaries, was not always darkness. It was, at times, a mirror. In the year 1291, a storm that had long gathered on the horizon finally broke upon the last great outpost of Christian rule in the Holy Land. That place was Acre, once vibrant, fortified, and proud, and now doomed. For the Templars, it would be their last stand on eastern soil. After decades of holding the coastline, the Crusader states had become thin and fractured. The kingdoms had shrunk to a few port cities, Acre, Tyre, Sidon, Beirut. Inland territory had been lost. Allied support from Europe had waned. The Great Crusades were now memories, and their ideals had dimmed in distant courts more preoccupied with their own wars. But the enemy had not forgotten. The Mamluks, a new Muslim power based in Cairo, had risen with purpose. Former slave soldiers, hardened by years of battle and internal struggle, they brought discipline and ferocity. Under Sultan al-Ashraf Khalil, they turned their full strength against the last Crusader holdouts. In early 1291, the Mamluk army marched north, vast and relentless. Acre, though fortified with high walls and towers, was not prepared for such a force. The Templars, alongside the Hospitallers and remaining Christian forces, readied their defences. Yet they knew what was coming. This would not be another siege. This would be the end. The assault began in May. The Templars manned the eastern walls. Their Grand Master, Guillaume de Beaujeu, stood with them, not in command alone, but in armor, on the ramparts. For days, they held back wave after wave of attackers. Arrows blackened the sky. Siege towers approached. Engines hurled stones with terrible force. But the defenders were few, the enemy many. And on May 18, a massive breach was made. The Mamluks poured into the city. Panic seized the streets. Civilians fled to the port, hoping for ships to carry them to Cyprus. The Templars, refusing to abandon the defense, counterattacked. Guillaume de Beaujeu was struck by an arrow and mortally wounded. As he fell, he cried, "Jem en fuis par, je suis mort." I am not fleeing, I am dead. His words became the epitaph of the city. The Templars retreated to their fortress at the edge of the harbour. There, they held out for 10 more days, surrounded and under constant bombardment. Negotiations were attempted, but trust had long since vanished. On May 28, the final assault came. The Templar stronghold collapsed into ruin. Some brothers died in the rubble. Others were captured and executed. A few escaped by sea. But Acre, the last jewel of the Latin East, was gone. With its fall, the Crusader dream in the Holy Land ended. No longer would there be Christian kingdoms in the East. No longer would Western knights march across Asia Minor toward Jerusalem. The Templars withdrew to Cyprus, their old refuge, now a place of exile. Their castles in Syria and Palestine were lost. Their mission, unchanged in heart, had lost its ground. But though the land was gone, the order remained. In the West, their power endured. Their estates, their wealth, their discipline, all intact. And even in defeat, their legend grew. For in Acre they had not surrendered. They had stood. As the smoke of Acre faded into history, the battered remnants of the Templar order gathered across the sea on the island of Cyprus, a land that had once been an afterthought, now transformed into their final bastion in the east. The retreat was not a march of triumph, but of necessity. The fall of Acre had stripped the order of its strongholds, its mission in the Holy Land, and many of its brothers. Those who survived, hardened by siege, shaken by loss, found themselves in a land both familiar and foreign. The crusade was over. The battlefield abandoned. Yet the rule endured. Cyprus, under the rule of the Lusignan kings, had grown into a refuge for displaced knights, merchants, and clergy from the east. The Templars already maintained commanderies there, and now they reinforced their presence, rebuilding defenses, stockpiling supplies, and tending to the survivors who had come by ship from Sidon, Tyre, and the fallen cities. The Grand Master at the time, Thibaut Gordon, had been elected amidst the ruins of Acre. With solemn care, he led the order in exile, working to stabilize its operations and refocus its mission. Though the Holy Land was lost, he insisted, the cause was not. From Cyprus, the Templars launched raids along the Syrian coast, striking at Mamluk positions and capturing prisoners, hoping to ransom Christian captives. They maintained a fleet of warships, ever watchful for opportunity, still envisioning a return to the mainland. Their efforts were small in scale, but fierce in spirit, reminders to friend and foe alike that the order had not vanished. Internally, they sought renewal. The rule was upheld with even greater rigor. New recruits arrived from Europe, inspired by tales of sacrifice and honor. Veterans passed on their knowledge. Training resumed. Accounts were settled. Commanderies across the West resumed their regular contributions to sustain the island base. Yet the order's purpose, to protect pilgrims and guard the Holy Sepulchre, now hung suspended in time. There were no more pilgrims to Jerusalem, no holy sites to defend. Cyprus became a monastery of waiting, where memory and mission dwelled together in silence. Tensions rose within the Crusader community. Some questioned whether the military orders should disband, now that their cause had no land to protect. Others, especially among the Templars and Hospitallers, argued for preparation, not dissolution. The East had been lost before, and reclaimed. It could be again. Plans were drawn. Proposals were made to Western courts and popes. Appeals for a new crusade were sent to kings. But Europe had changed. The urgency that once drove knights across seas had faded. Politics, rivalries, and heresies now distracted Christian rulers. Still, the Templars held on. They rebuilt not only their walls, but their vision, adapting, surviving, waiting for the call they believed would surely come again. But in the stillness of Cyprus, a different storm was forming, not from the deserts of Syria, but from the courts of France. A storm of words, ambition, and suspicion. And this time, it would not strike from without, but from within Christendom itself. While the Templars rebuilt their strength in Cyprus, far to the west, in the heart of Europe, a far more insidious threat was beginning to take shape. Unlike Saladin or the Mamluks, this enemy did not ride under the crescent, nor siege castles with catapults. He wore a crown, sat upon a throne, and ruled in the name of Christ. His name was Philip IV of France. Known to history as Philip the Fair, the king was a man of cold ambition. His reign was marked by conflict with the papacy, heavy taxation, and a ceaseless need for money to fund his wars and consolidate power. He had already driven the Jews from France, seizing their assets. He had attacked the clergy. And now, his gaze turned to the Templars. To Philip, the order was both an opportunity and an obstacle. They were immensely wealthy, with lands, treasuries, and commanderies across France. They answered not to him, but to the Pope. They held secrets. They had influence. And worst of all, they owed him nothing. He had tried, years earlier, to join the order himself, not as a monk, but as a partner in a grand plan to merge the Templars and Hospitallers into a single force under royal command. The idea was rebuffed. The Templars had no king but Christ. Wounded in pride, burdened by debt, and eager to control their fortune, Philip began to plot. He needed a justification, not conquest, but condemnation. And so his agents began to collect accusations, whispers, and confessions wrung from informers or created by design. Heresy, idolatry, unnatural acts, all cloaked in secrecy, all impossible to prove or disprove. It mattered little whether they were true. It mattered only that they could be believed. In 1305, Clement V was elected Pope, a Frenchman, installed with Philip's support. Though technically sovereign, Clement was increasingly under royal pressure. The Church was no longer the independent arbiter it had once been. Now, its authority was entangled in the web of royal intrigue. The Templars, unaware of the storm building around them, continued their work, training, praying, managing estates. Their Grand Master, Jacques de Molay, travelled to France in 1306 to discuss reform and future plans with the Pope. He found instead a court filled with silence and suspicion. Then, on Friday the 13th of October, 1307, the blow fell. Across France, at dawn, royal officers descended upon Templar commanderies. Knights were arrested en masse. Documents seized. Vaults broken open. Torture began. The charges were sweeping and grotesque, denying Christ, spitting on the cross, worshipping idols, engaging in forbidden rites. Under agony, many confessed. But those who withstood torture denied all. De Molay himself, stunned and bewildered, confessed under duress, then later recanted. Philip presented the arrests as a righteous act, a cleansing of heresy. But those who looked deeper saw the truth. It was a seizure of power, a destruction of independence, an act of calculated betrayal. The Pope, hesitant and conflicted, wavered. At first shocked, he later sanctioned the arrests. The wheels of inquiry turned. And what had begun as a matter of royal greed was now being dressed as divine justice. For the first time, the greatest threat to the Templars came not from across the desert, but from within the very world they had sworn to protect. And as the trials began, so too began the unraveling of an order that had stood, unshaken, for 2 centuries. The trials of the Knights Templar marked one of the most extraordinary and troubling episodes in medieval history, a spectacle of accusation and coercion cloaked in the garb of legal process. As the year 1307 ended, the order stood not before an army, but before the Inquisition. In Paris and throughout France, Templar knights were imprisoned, isolated, and interrogated. The inquisitors, often acting under royal command, employed the harshest methods: chains, starvation, and torture. The rule of the temple, which had demanded silence and obedience, now became a weapon in the hands of their enemies. Few knights knew the full scope of what was happening. Fewer still could organize a defense. The accusations were as sensational as they were implausible, that the brothers had denied Christ during their initiation, trampled on the cross, worshipped a mysterious idol named Baphomet, and practiced obscene rituals in secret. These charges, rooted in rumor and malice, found fertile ground in a public eager for drama and scandal. Under torture, many confessed, not because the charges were true, but because the pain was too great. Some later recanted. Others, broken in body and spirit, remained silent. The trials dragged on, case by case, city by city. Outside France, responses were mixed. In England, Edward II initially resisted the arrests, skeptical of the charges. In Aragon, the inquisitors found little evidence. In Germany, the Templars were supported by local rulers. But the Pope, Clement V, increasingly under Philip's influence, issued the papal bull Pastorales Preeminentiae, ordering all Christian monarchs to arrest Templars and seize their properties. The machinery of condemnation now bore the name of the Church. Jacques de Molay, the Grand Master, was held in Paris, along with Geoffroy de Charny, the preceptor of Normandy. After years of captivity, they were brought before a commission in 1310. When asked to confirm their earlier confessions, they astonished the court by denying everything. They spoke clearly, without fear. The charges, they said, were lies. The order was pure. This moment of courage had grave consequences. In retaliation, Philip ordered 54 Templars who had likewise recanted to be burned at the stake, a mass execution that shocked even hardened onlookers. The Pope, now desperate to contain the crisis, summoned a general council to determine the fate of the order. The Council of Vienne opened in 1311. There, bishops, theologians, and envoys debated the charges. No clear evidence had emerged. No idol had been found. No rite had been witnessed. Yet the shadow of Philip loomed. In 1312, Clement, bowing to pressure, issued the bull Vox in Excelso, officially dissolving the Order of the Temple. Not condemned, but suppressed. The Templars were declared not guilty by definitive proof, but deemed too controversial, too divisive to remain. Their lands and wealth, in theory, were to be transferred to the Hospitallers. In practice, much was seized by local lords or retained by the crown. The Templars were gone from the maps. Their rule, their castles, their Red Cross, erased by decree. But in the hearts of those who had known them, the story was not over. It would end, not in silence, but in fire. The final chapter in the life of the Templar Order did not unfold in battle or courtroom, but on a small island in the heart of Paris, the Isle de la Cite, where the river Seine flowed past Notre Dame and the royal palace cast its long shadow. There, on the evening of March 18, 1314, two figures were led before a pile of dry wood. One was Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master of the Knights Templar. The other, Geoffroy de Charny, preceptor of Normandy. They had spent nearly 7 years in prison, years marked by interrogation, deprivation, and attempts to force confession. That morning, they had been summoned before a panel of cardinals to hear the terms of their sentence. It was not death. They were to be imprisoned for life, under church custody, spared, it seemed, the stake. But when asked to repeat their earlier admissions of guilt, both men refused. De Maulery, after long silence, stood firm. "I acknowledge," he said, "that I have indeed committed the greatest crime, by falsely confessing to those horrible charges, to save my life." Charney echoed him. "We are innocent," he declared, "and the order is pure." Their defiance stunned the court. No one had expected it. The verdict had already been prepared. Now, suddenly, it was undone. Philip IV, already present in Paris and known for his ruthless resolve, acted without hesitation. He ordered both men to be burned that very evening, without further trial, without appeal. A pyre was hastily constructed on a small islet beside the palace. As the flames rose, the two knights stood without flinching. Witnesses reported that De Maulery, even as the fire consumed him, called upon God to judge the injustice done that day. He is said to have cried out that Pope Clement and King Philip would soon face divine reckoning. Within a year, both men were dead, Clement in April, and Philip in November. Chroniclers would later say the Grand Master's curse had taken them. The execution of De Maulery marked not only the end of a life, but the final dissolution of a brotherhood that had stood for nearly 2 centuries. The ashes of the order scattered into history, no longer a force in arms, but a shadow in memory. Yet the silence left behind was not empty. In the centuries that followed, legends grew. Some whispered that Templar treasures had been hidden, that secret branches had survived in distant lands, that their knowledge had passed into other hands. The Red Cross, once flown on banners, now flickered in the minds of poets, conspirators, and seekers. But what remains clear is this: Jack de Maulery died not as a heretic, but as a man of conviction, refusing to betray his brothers, his oath, or the truth. And in the glow of that final fire, something of the Templar spirit endured, solemn, silent, and unbroken. With the death of Jacques de Maulery, the visible structure of the Knights Templar was gone. But the aftershocks of their fall rippled far beyond the Seine. What had once been a cornerstone of Crusader Christendom now vanished, not into oblivion, but into fragments, scattered across kingdoms and memories. Pope Clement's suppression of the order had stipulated that all Templar assets be transferred to the Knights Hospitaller. Yet reality defied paper. In many regions, secular rulers seized the wealth for themselves. Lands were absorbed into royal domains. Fortresses were claimed by barons. Livestock, rents, and coin quietly changed hands, not in defense of the cross, but to fill coffers. In England, Edward II hesitated, then relented to papal pressure. The English Templars were arrested, interrogated without torture, and ultimately released into monastic life or quiet obscurity. Many blended into the countryside, taking roles as chaplains, scribes, or labourers. In Portugal, the outcome was strikingly different. King Denis, sympathetic to the Templars and skeptical of the charges, negotiated with the Pope. In 1319, he founded a new order, the Ordem de Cristo, the Order of Christ. Many former Templars joined its ranks. Their lands remained intact. Their mission, adapted. In time, It would be this order that supported the Portuguese Age of Discovery, sending ships far across unknown seas. Spain followed a similar path. Some Templar properties were absorbed by local military orders like Calatrava and Mornessar. Others faded into disuse. But the spirit of crusading, and of chivalric brotherhood, remained strong in the Iberian kingdoms, still engaged in the Reconquista against Muslim rule. In Germany and Eastern Europe, where the Teutonic Knights held sway, the Templars left less trace. Their legacy lived more in legend than in law. The Church, eager to close the chapter, discouraged discussion of the trials. But the memory could not be buried so easily. Chroniclers recorded the injustice. Poets lamented the silence of once proud castles. Among the common people, stories spread of hidden treasure, of secret tunnels, of knights who had escaped and founded new orders in the shadows. Whether true or not, these tales gave form to the feeling that something noble had been betrayed. In time, the Red Cross faded from walls and standards. But it did not disappear entirely. Stone by stone, former Templar sites were repurposed, chapels rededicated, commanderies turned into farms or manor houses. Yet some places resisted change. In rural France, the Temple Church in Paris lay quiet, its towers outliving the dynasty that had destroyed its guardians. Centuries later, when revolution swept through France, mobs stormed the prison where de Molerie had died. His name, once erased, returned. And in Freemasonry, in literature, and in modern myth, the Templar legacy found strange and scattered echoes. But the truth, beyond myth, remained this: the Templars had not vanished in defeat. They had been undone by power, not of armies, but of kings. Their memory, though scarred, endured. And in that endurance, the flame of their mission, justice, order, and faith in the face of death, still flickered. When the Templar order fell, its heir in law, and in many ways in spirit, became the Knights Hospitaller. They, too, had begun in Jerusalem. They, too, had worn the mantle of warrior monks. And unlike the Templars, they had survived the shifting tides of crusade and courtly politics. The papal bulls that suppressed the Templars in 1312 directed that their properties, rights, and resources be transferred to the Hospitallers. In theory, this was a gesture of continuity. The holy mission would go on, merely under a different banner. But in practice, the transition was far from smooth. Many secular rulers delayed or resisted the transfer. In France, Philip IV's agents dragged their feet, wary of allowing another powerful order to rise. In other regions, local nobles held on to Templar lands through legal trickery or brute force. It took decades for the Hospitallers to secure even a portion of what had once belonged to the Temple. Still, over time, much did pass into their hands. The Hospitallers inherited castles, farms, mills, and estates, along with obligations to maintain the charitable and military functions once performed by the Templars. They also took up the role of maritime defenders in the eastern Mediterranean, continuing the struggle against Islamic navies and pirates. After the fall of Acre and the loss of the Holy Land, the Hospitallers had relocated to Cyprus. From there, they launched their next great endeavor, the conquest of Rhodes. By 1310, they had established a sovereign stronghold on the island, turning it into a formidable bastion of Christian resistance. Templar veterans, now absorbed into the Hospitallers or other regional orders, brought their knowledge and discipline to this new base. Fortifications were strengthened. Naval power expanded. The order now wore black, not white, and bore the 8-pointed cross, but the ethos of vigilance and order remained. The Hospitallers also took on a new administrative burden. Managing the far-flung network of former Templar properties required diligence. Records were rewritten. Titles confirmed. Priories re-established. And amid it all, the ghosts of the temple lingered. In certain churches and castles, traces of the Red Cross remained, faded from banners but not from stone. Some chapels still bore inscriptions left by Templar hands. And among the Hospitallers themselves, there was quiet recognition that what they now held had been bought, in part, with the blood of their fallen brethren. Relations between the two orders had not always been warm. But the Hospitallers knew the value of what the Templars had built. They preserved what they could, reusing infrastructure, retaining loyal servants, and in some cases honoring old oaths of protection. Thus, while the temple as an institution had been destroyed, much of its structure endured, folded into the fabric of its rival-turned-successor. And so the mission lived on. Not exactly as before. The era of crusades was waning. The Church's authority was shifting. But the ideal of holy knighthood, of charity bound to courage, did not vanish. It sailed again, from Rhodes and later from Malta, under black sails and white crosses. And within its ranks beat the pulse of a legacy once marked in red. In the centuries following their dissolution, the memory of the Knights Templar did not fade, it transformed. No longer a living order, they became legend. Where once they stood in armor, now they marched through the minds of poets, historians, and conspirators alike. The first stories were whispered. That the Templars had hidden treasures beneath their commanderies. That they had escaped Philip's wrath by fleeing to Scotland or sailing west to unknown shores. That their secret rituals, invented by their enemies, had in fact been real, guarding ancient knowledge passed down in silence. These tales grew in the absence of answers. The suddenness of their fall, the mystery of their inner life, the horror of their end, all fed the imagination. Writers embellished. Chroniclers speculated. By the time of the Renaissance, the Templars were no longer just knights. They had become keepers of secrets, guardians of lost wisdom, victims of a vast injustice. In the 18th century, new voices picked up the thread. The Freemasons, a society of symbolic brotherhood and moral philosophy, began to associate their rites and symbols with the Templars. Whether true or not, the claim gave weight to their ceremonies and connected them to an ancient tradition of resistance and loyalty. In Masonic lodges across Europe, the Red Cross was reborn, not in battle, but in ceremony. The French Revolution saw another turn. Revolutionaries, hostile to the monarchy and the Church, saw in the Templars a symbol of betrayal by corrupt power. De Moleris' martyrdom became a symbol of justice denied. His curse, whether apocryphal or real, echoed in the fall of kings. In modern times, the Templars entered popular culture with renewed vigor. Novels, films, and video games portrayed them as warrior philosophers, as shadowy cabals, as protectors of relics and bloodlines. From the Da Vinci Code to Assassin's Creed, their image was reimagined, often far from truth, yet always compelling. And yet, beneath the myths, the real story remained. They were not sorcerers or treasure keepers. They were not immortals. They were men, disciplined, devout, shaped by a brutal age. They believed, with solemn clarity, that the world could be guarded not by might alone, but by faith tempered with structure. That evil could be held back by walls, vows, and sacrifice. Historians have returned to the sources, to the rule of the temple, to the records of trial and land, to the bones of their fortresses, and begun to restore the Templars to their rightful place. Not as myths, but as men. Not as villains or saints, but as a brotherhood that rose with purpose and fell by politics. Their story is a mirror. In it, we see courage and error, loyalty and pride, power and its cost. And in the quiet ruins where they once prayed and trained, the wind still whispers not secrets, but memory. Though the Order of the Temple was disbanded over 700 years ago, the world they built still speaks. Across Europe and the Mediterranean, stone walls, worn staircases, and silent chapels bear witness to their presence. To walk these places today is to trace the outline of their vanished world, not in legend, but in limestone and light. France, their birthplace and stronghold, holds many of these echoes. In Paris, the once mighty temple compound is gone, replaced by city streets and memory. Yet fragments survive, a few stones preserved, records held in archives, the tower once used as a prison. Here, Jacques de Molay passed his final days, and here, history left its scar. Farther south, the rural commanderies offer deeper immersion. At La Couvertoirade and Saint-Eulalie-de-Cernan, the Templars built entire fortified villages. Their architecture remains, squat towers, ringed walls, simple chapels. Not opulent, but enduring. Pilgrims still visit, not to pray, but to remember. In Portugal, the legacy shines brightest at Tomar. Founded in 1160 by the first Grand Master of the Portuguese Templars, the Convent of Christ became one of the most remarkable Templar sites in the world. Here, the round church, modelled on Jerusalem's Holy Sepulchre, stands as a jewel of Romanesque design. After the order was transformed into the Knights of Christ, Tomar flourished. Later kings added Gothic cloisters, Renaissance details, and nautical symbols of empire. To stand in Tomar is to see the Templar spirit translated across time, from warrior monks to explorers of oceans. England's most famous site lies quietly in London, the Temple Church. Built by the Templars in the 12th century, it still stands between Fleet Street and the Thames. Its round nave mirrors the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, a spiritual compass pointing back to Jerusalem. Within lie stone effigies of knights, hands clasped, eyes closed, enduring guardians of a long-vanished cause. Other sites lie scattered. In Spain, the fortress at Ponferrada rises in Leon, a blend of medieval power and quiet stonework. In Cyprus, ruins near Colossi whisper of the final outposts. In Italy, small chapels bear the red cross carved into their lintels. In the Holy Land, the once proud castles now lie in ruin, Safed, Tortosa, Chastel Blanc, overtaken by grass, sky, and silence. These places are not shrines to war, but to endurance. They remind us that the Templars, whatever the myths, lived real lives, built, governed, defended. That their faith, however strict, inspired architecture that could withstand centuries. That their fall, however unjust, did not erase their work. Modern visitors come with curiosity, not crusade. They walk where knights once marched. They listen to guides, read inscriptions, trace fingers over chisel marks left by medieval hands. And in that simple act, something is restored. The Templars are not gone. Not entirely. Their story remains, not just in books and legends, but in stone, shadow, and the quiet spaces where memory lingers. Behind every sword drawn in battle, behind every fortress raised on foreign soil, there beat a quieter force, the rule. Not the rule of kings or law, but of daily discipline, of order in the soul. It was this framework, adopted early and shaped by Bernard of Clairvaux, that held the Knights Templar together across centuries and continents. The rule of the Temple, formalized in 1129, outlined the life a brother was to live, not one of glory, but of service. Templars were forbidden personal wealth. Their clothing was plain, usually white, symbolizing purity. Food was simple, eaten in silence, without indulgence. Brothers slept fully clothed, ready to rise at any moment. Laughter was discouraged. Vanity was condemned. They owned nothing, not even the horse they rode. Days were shaped by prayer, work, and readiness. Matins before dawn. Mass at sunrise. Labor, training, council, or patrol. Then prayers again, at midday, at dusk, at night. The rhythm was monastic, but the body was that of a soldier. Their code forbade retreat in battle unless outnumbered 3-1. Cowardice was treated not with punishment, but with deep shame. Bravery was expected, but so too was obedience. The will of the master, of each commander, and ultimately of the Grand Master, was law. And above that, the will of God. Yet this was no blind obedience. The rule also bound the leaders. No master could rule without the consent of his council. No campaign could begin without careful consideration. Brothers could speak freely in chapter meetings, confess doubts, ask for forgiveness. Hierarchy existed, but so did fraternity. Initiation into the order was not ceremonial, it was solemn. A man knelt, often in the dim light of a chapel, and swore to live in poverty, chastity, and obedience until death. He received a mantle, white with a red cross, and the brotherhood of warriors who had taken the same vow. No family ties remained. No private goals. Only the mission. The rule governed not only the soul, but the sword. Templars were taught to fight as one. Not for personal honor, but for the unit. In battle, they charged in formation, disciplined and unbreakable. They were trained to defend, to wait, to strike, not to boast or seek glory. And yet, their reputation grew not because they defied the rule, but because they embodied it. That discipline, the refusal to retreat, the silence in hardship, the simplicity of dress, became their legend. In a world of shifting loyalties and corrupt courts, the Templars offered something rare: predictability. Wherever they went, their rule followed. It shaped their houses, their meals, their speech. It made them brothers, not merely soldiers. Even as power grew, even as wealth flowed from European donors, the rule remained the backbone. Revisions came, to manage lands, to handle prisoners, to regulate finances, but the core stood firm. Today, reading it brings clarity: these were not warriors of impulse, but men of code. Their strength came not just from arms, but from the daily practice of restraint and commitment. In that, perhaps, lies the real secret of their endurance. Not treasure. Not magic. Discipline. Though the Templars were known as warriors, their true power rested in something quieter and more enduring: a vast and disciplined economic machine. By the height of their influence, the Order had become one of the most efficient landowners, bankers, and logisticians in medieval Europe. It began with gifts. Nobles, moved by piety or in search of spiritual protection, donated lands, mills, vineyards, and entire villages to the Templars. These were not symbolic gestures. They were real wealth: worked fields, tax-producing tenants, rivers full of fish, forests of timber. Every gift expanded the Templar web. These properties, called commanderies, were not idle holdings. They were managed with care. Brothers or sergeants oversaw crops, collected rents, organized labor, and maintained roads. Surpluses were stored, sold, or shipped to the east. Each commandery was both a religious outpost and a fiscal node. The Order's structure allowed for remarkable coordination. Local houses reported to provincial masters. Provincial accounts flowed to the treasury. From there, resources could be moved swiftly: food to castles under siege, silver to buy ships, grain to support campaigns. Their economic reach was continental. In England, they held farms and manors. In Spain, olive groves and herds. In Italy, ports and warehouses. In France, entire towns paid tithe to the temple. All of it connected through ledgers, letters, and loyalty. And then there was their banking. Because the Templars were trusted, they became natural stewards of money. Pilgrims could deposit funds in Europe and withdraw them in the Levant, using written certificates, an early form of credit. Nobles stored treasure in Templar vaults, safe from war and theft. Kings borrowed from them. The Church used their network. Their temples in Paris, London, and other capitals became more than churches. They were banks, quiet, guarded, and precise. This economic strength gave the Order resilience and enemies. Their independence from secular tax, their closed books, their ability to fund armies without royal aid, all of it stirred resentment. But it also kept them alive. When Crusader states struggled, the Templars endured. When kingdoms fractured, their chain of command held. Their wealth was not for indulgence, it was for mission. Armies marched not on ideals alone, but on bread and iron. The temple provided both. And so, when people looked at the Order from outside, at the stone castles and the disciplined ranks, they often misunderstood what made it work. It was not just courage. It was grain, ledgers, logistics, order. The rule had taught them how to live. But it was this quiet engine, fields plowed, books balanced, ships filled, that allowed them to do so for nearly 200 years. A brotherhood in arms, yes. But also a brotherhood in balance, between sword and scale. From their founding, the Templars owed their allegiance not to any king or noble, but to the Pope alone. This unique position, above secular rule, yet tied to the Church, gave them both power and peril. It shaped their rise, enabled their reach, and in time, contributed to their undoing. In 1129, at the Council of Troyes, the Templars were officially recognized by the Church. This papal endorsement, guided by the Cistercian Abbot Bernard of Clairvaux, gave them legitimacy. It also gave them protection. Papal bulls followed, On Datum Optimum in 1139, Knights Templar in 1144, and Militia Dei in 1145, granting privileges no other order enjoyed. They could collect tithes. They were exempt from local taxes. They answered only to Rome. Their chapels were free from episcopal oversight. Their commanders could hear confessions, bury the dead, and perform sacraments. In effect, the Templars became a parallel ecclesiastical structure, tightly bound to the Holy See, yet functionally autonomous. This special status allowed them to operate across borders. While other institutions were trapped in local politics, the Templars moved freely, guided by Rome and the rule. Papal favor also brought them responsibility. Popes entrusted them with missions, messages, and diplomacy. Templars served as couriers, guards, and mediators. Their network, spanning Christendom and the East, was invaluable to the papal court. In times of war, they were the Church's shield. In times of peace, its sword in reserve. Yet this close bond came at a cost. Their independence drew jealousy. Bishops resented their privileges. Monarchs chafed at their tax immunity. The order became both admired and resented, seen as a power unto itself, neither fully clerical nor fully secular. By the late 13th century, the Church itself had changed. The papacy, once mobile and austere, had become entangled in politics, wealth, and national rivalries. Under Pope Boniface VIII, conflict erupted with King Philip IV of France. The tension between spiritual and temporal power reached a breaking point. After Boniface's death, Philip influenced the election of Clement V, a French pope, who relocated the papal court to Avignon, effectively placing the Holy See under French shadow. It was during this vulnerable time that the Templars were arrested. Though many within the Church doubted the charges, the machinery of power turned. Under pressure, Clement V first wavered, then yielded. He convened commissions. He sought compromise. But in the end, he suppressed the order, not by conviction, but by force of royal will. It was a betrayal, subtle but complete. The Templars had trusted the Church. They had lived under its law, carried its cross, and died by its word. When the hour came, the Pope should have been their shield. Instead, he became their silence. Yet not all voices in the church were complicit. Some bishops resisted. Some abbots defended the brothers. And later generations of clergy, more distant from royal fear, would reflect on the injustice. In this, the Templar story mirrors the broader struggles of the Middle Ages, between faith and power, between church and state, between conscience and command. And it asks a quiet question: when loyalty runs upward, who stands for those below? Of all the threads that linger from the Templar story, few have captured the imagination like the fate of their fleet. Unlike castles that crumbled or treasuries that were seized, the ships of the Temple vanished quietly, leaving behind whispers, theories, and shadows on the sea. The Templars had long been a maritime power. Though not sailors by origin, their need to move men, goods, and messages across the Mediterranean required ships. By the 13th century, their fleet was substantial, especially in ports like Acre, Sidon, and later, Limassol in Cyprus and La Rochelle in France. They operated galleys and merchant vessels, built or hired in Italian yards or staffed with seasoned crews. These ships ferried pilgrims to the Holy Land, moved grain from Europe to Outremer, carried armor, timber, even horses. And in wartime, they were refitted for battle, to patrol the coasts, to escort convoys, to intercept corsairs. After the fall of Acre in 1291, the Templars concentrated their naval power in Cyprus and France. La Rochelle, a port on the Atlantic coast, became a central hub. There, ships were moored, supplies gathered, and westward trade conducted. Some believe that the fleet based at La Rochelle, a dozen or more vessels, was not present when the French arrests began in 1307. This absence is the seed of legend. For when the Templars were seized on that fateful Friday the 13th, their ships had seemingly disappeared. No vessels were found in port. No records of seizure exist. It was as if the fleet had vanished into mist. Some chroniclers later suggested that the Templars, warned in advance, had slipped away, sailing into the Atlantic, taking treasure, documents, or relics with them. Others claimed they headed to Scotland, where royal hostility was less. Some even imagined voyages to the New World, centuries before Columbus, an idea more poetic than plausible, but enduring nonetheless. Historians, cautious by nature, suggest simpler answers. The fleet may have scattered. Some ships may have been sold or absorbed by allies. Crews, sensing danger, may have fled. Maritime records from the period are sparse, and the silence surrounding the Templar fleet may reflect the chaos of the time more than a grand design. Yet the mystery remains. Because the fleet was real. Because it was mobile. And because, unlike land or fortress, ships leave fewer traces. It is known that in Portugal, some former Templar mariners were welcomed into the newly formed Order of Christ, which later played a central role in navigation and exploration. Caravels bearing crosses set sail from Lisbon not long after, seeking unknown shores. Whether those ships bore the spirit of the Temple, no one can say. But the sea, wide and unknowable, became the final refuge for a story that refused to stay moored. A final frontier, not for conquest, but for legend. In Portugal, the memory of the Templars did not end in fire, it transformed. While France extinguished the order in blood, Portugal reproposed its flame. The result was not only survival, but renaissance, a continuity that would shape the very age of global discovery. King Denis of Portugal, wise and pragmatic, understood the injustice of the accusations and the value of the men who had borne the cross. When Pope Clement V issued the bull suppressing the Templars, Denis negotiated an alternative. In 1319, with papal approval, he founded the Ordem de Cristo, the Order of Christ, as a successor. Many former Templars joined this new order. Their properties were transferred, their mission reframed. No longer tasked with defending the Holy Land, they now served the Portuguese crown, a Christian nation still engaged in the Reconquista, still looking outward. At the heart of this transformation stood the city of Tomar, once a Templar stronghold. The Convent of Christ, with its round church and fortress walls, became the seat of the Order of Christ. From there, a new kind of mission began, not to retake Jerusalem, but to explore and evangelize distant lands. In the 15th century, under the leadership of Prince Henry the Navigator, himself the Grand Master of the Order of Christ, the Portuguese turned their eyes to the sea. They built ships, trained sailors, studied maps, and funded voyages. The Red Cross of the Templars, now reborn as the emblem of the Order of Christ, sailed on the sails of caravels bound for Africa, India, and beyond. This was no coincidence. The organizational discipline, logistical experience, and religious zeal that had defined the Templars now shaped the explorers. The spirit of mission endured, transformed, yes, but familiar. Under Henry's guidance, Portuguese ships rounded Cape Bojador, explored the Gulf of Guinea, and laid the groundwork for an empire that would span continents. Vasco da Gama, when he reached India in 1498, sailed under that same Red Cross, a symbol carried not for conquest alone, but for Christian expansion. The Order of Christ continued to exist, not only as a religious body but as an engine of Portuguese ambition. It funded voyages, educated navigators, and sanctified the maritime path. In its rituals and symbols, the memory of the temple lingered, reimagined not in war, but in wind and wave. Thus, the legacy of the Templars did not end in 1314. It lived on, in Portuguese ports, in the carved stone of Tomar, in the flags of fleets that sailed into the unknown. They had once defended the Holy Land. Now, they mapped the world. And in this, perhaps, lies their most enduring paradox, that an order born to protect pilgrims on dusty roads became, through fire, exile, and reinvention, one of the unseen architects of the age of exploration. With the passing centuries, as the facts of the Templars grew distant, the shadows around them lengthened. In the absence of their living presence, stories took root, stories of treasure, secrets, and survival. The Templars, once an order of monks and warriors, became figures in legend, wrapped in mystery and veiled suggestion. It began with their sudden fall. Few institutions of such power had ever been destroyed so quickly. One day they guarded kings, the next, they were prisoners. Their treasure was never found. Their fleet vanished. Their rituals, never public, now became a canvas for imagination. And into this silence poured questions, then answers born not of record, but of wonder. One of the earliest and most persistent tales was that of the hidden Templar treasure, gold and relics spirited away before the arrests, perhaps buried beneath Paris, or carried across seas to safe havens. Some pointed to Scotland, where the Templars may have found refuge under sympathetic nobles. Others speculated that their wealth was hidden in cryptic codes and secret maps, awaiting rediscovery. The most famous invention of later centuries was the idea that the Templars had preserved a secret knowledge of Christ's bloodline, or ancient wisdom from the Temple of Solomon, or esoteric truth suppressed by the Church. These notions took root in the Enlightenment, as reason and doubt spread alongside fascination with lost truths. By the 18th century, the Freemasons, themselves heirs to symbolic traditions, began to weave the Templars into their own lore. Some Masonic rites claimed descent from Templar survivors. Others borrowed the symbols, the Red Cross, the Knight, the Temple. Whether literal or allegorical, the connection gave weight to Masonic rituals and broadened the Templars' legacy. The French Revolution added fuel. As kings fell and the old order shattered, the Templars were remembered not as servants of church and crown, but as victims of their betrayal. Some revolutionaries whispered that the execution of Louis XVI had fulfilled de Molaris' curse, a fabled prophecy spoken from the stake, calling the Pope and King to judgment. In the modern era, popular culture embraced the myths. Novels, films, and television turned the Templars into puzzle pieces in grand conspiracies. In stories like the Da Vinci Code, they were guardians of forbidden truth. In games and fiction, they became hidden powers behind history. Yet beneath the fiction, a quieter truth endures. The real Templars left no evidence of treasure, no codes, no rituals of secret knowledge. They were men of discipline, duty, and faith. Their silence was not mystery, it was monasticism. Their secrecy was not conspiracy, it was obedience. But the myth speaks to something deeper, a longing for continuity, for meaning lost and rediscovered. The Templars, in their fall, became a symbol of courage betrayed, of truth hidden, of power misused. And so their name persists, not merely in books, but in the collective mind. Not because of what they were, but because of what we wish they had been. Among the many marks left by the Templars upon history, none is more enduring, or more evocative, than the Red Cross. Simple in form, yet charged with significance, it came to define the order, not merely as an emblem on the chest, but as a living expression of faith, sacrifice, and mission. The cross was worn on the white mantle of the knight, a garment that itself symbolized purity of heart and vow of chastity. The red of the cross signified martyrdom, a reminder that the Templar must be willing to shed his blood in service to Christ. It was not merely decoration. It was a declaration. This symbol was granted formally in 1147 by Pope Eugene III, during the Second Crusade. From that point forward, it became inseparable from the order's identity. Wherever Templars rode, into battle, into council, into exile, the cross rode with them. Its shape was most often a simple cross patee, arms widening at the ends, bold and clear. It could be stitched into cloth, carved into stone, or painted onto shields and ships. It needed no explanation. In an age of symbols and signs, it was instantly known. On the battlefield, it inspired fear and respect. Muslim chroniclers often distinguished the Templars by their banners and cross, noting their steadfastness and resolve. To friend and foe alike, the Red Cross meant something unbending, men who would not flee, who fought not for gold, but for God. In ceremonies, the cross was sacred. During initiation, a knight received his mantle in a solemn rite, watched by brothers, guided by prayer. When a Templar died, he was buried with the cross upon him, the last mark he bore, linking him to his vow and his cause. Even after the fall of the order, the Red Cross did not vanish. It reappeared in the Order of Christ in Portugal. It flew on the sails of caravels as they pushed past the edges of the known world. It found echoes in the insignia of later knightly orders, and in the Red Cross of St. George, of Crusader memory. But perhaps most deeply, it endured in meaning. The Red Cross came to stand for sacrifice. Not blind violence, but willing offering. It was the sign of those who set aside comfort and ambition to serve something higher, whether a city, a shrine, or an ideal. In modern times, it reappears, sometimes in confusion, sometimes in homage. It has become the subject of stories, adopted in symbols, even appropriated in strange causes. But in its truest sense, it remains what it was, a mark of selfless service. The Templars did not invent the cross, but they bore it, in silence and in strength, across deserts, over walls, and into legend. And for those who still seek meaning in their story, the Red Cross offers not answers, but a quiet invitation. To stand firm. To live with purpose. To carry what is hard, not for glory, but for good. Far from the roaring of battles and the solemnity of councils, the heart of the Templar world beat quietly, in the routine of the commandery. These were not castles of legend or fortresses at the edge of war, but centers of daily life, scattered across Europe. Here, the order lived its rule, served its purpose, and sustained its greater mission. A commandery was a blend of monastery, farm, and administrative hub. Often located in the countryside, it included a chapel, dormitories, kitchens, stables, and agricultural lands. Some were simple and modest. Others, especially in wealthy regions, grew into complexes with mills, vineyards, guest houses, and workshops. The day began before dawn. At the ringing of a bell, the brothers rose and assembled in the chapel for matins, the first prayer of the divine office. Their voices, quiet and measured, filled the early dark. Then came prime, followed by the first tasks of the day, tending fields, managing inventories, supervising tenants, or practicing arms. Each commandery had its master, a senior brother responsible for governance, assisted by a small staff. The brothers were not idle monks. They were stewards, working the land or overseeing those who did. They maintained livestock, harvested grain, brewed ale, made repairs, and kept accounts. Templar commanderies also served as way stations. Pilgrims and travelers might rest there. Messengers came and went. Horses were kept for transport. Armor and supplies were stored. The flow of goods and information was steady, a quiet stream feeding the greater river of the order's enterprise. Meals were simple and communal. 2 meals a day, often bread, vegetables, cheese, and occasionally fish or meat. Silence was kept while eating, broken only for readings from scripture or the rule. Brothers sat together, rank acknowledged but humility expected. Discipline was constant. Brothers confessed regularly. They obeyed without question. They wore plain clothing, white for knights, brown or black for sergeants. They wrote few letters, kept no personal possessions, and spent free time in prayer or study. Their vow was not only of poverty, but of purpose. Not all in the commandery were knights. Many were lay brothers or servants, workers who shared in the order's life but without taking full vows. They, too, were part of the rhythm, trusted, valued, and included in the mission. Though life in the commandery was removed from battle, its spirit remained. Weapons were maintained. Horses trained. Visitors from the east brought news of sieges, losses, and victories. Every action, from ploughing a field to sealing a letter, was done with the awareness that it served a larger cause. This was the true engine of the Templars. Not just the sword, but the hand that tilled. Not just the chapel in Jerusalem, but the small one in Normandy or Castile. Not only the hero in armor, but the brother at prayer, the steward at work, the cook in silence. For in every corner of the order, the same rule guided them. The same cross was worn. The same vow remembered. And it was here, in the quiet places, that the Templars truly endured, long after the banners fell, long after the castles crumbled. In stone, in soil, in service. The Templar order, by design and rule, was a brotherhood. Its members were men, bound by vows of chastity, obedience, and poverty. Yet the world in which they lived was not divided so neatly. Women, though formally excluded from membership, played roles around and within the periphery of the order's life. The rule of the temple was explicit: no woman could be admitted into the order. This was not unusual for the time. Monastic and military orders alike maintained strict male-only vows, fearing distraction, scandal, and the collapse of discipline. The Templars went further still. Their rule forbade even the touch of women, in affection or in jest. They were to avoid their company, not merely in deed, but in spirit. Yet, despite these strictures, women were not entirely absent. Many women, noble and common, became benefactors. They granted lands, gave endowments, or donated in memory of husbands and sons. Some did so out of piety, others out of admiration for the order's cause. Their names are found in charters, alongside bishops and kings. In this way, women helped build the economic base of the temple. Widows of knights sometimes turned to the Templars for protection or spiritual guidance. The order, respected for its discipline and neutrality, could serve as arbiter in disputes or custodian of property. Templar commanderies occasionally managed estates on behalf of noble women, ensuring income or safety. In a few exceptional cases, women may have lived near or within Templar houses, especially in urban areas. These were often servants, cooks, or caretakers. Their presence was permitted only under careful rules, and they were kept apart from the professed brothers. Such arrangements were rare and heavily supervised. Some women also found parallel roles in other orders. While the Templars admitted no sisters, the Hospitallers, their counterparts in both war and care, had associated female communities in certain regions. These women served in hospitals, nursed the sick, and lived under modified rules. Their lives, while constrained, offered paths of service in a religious military context. One of the few surviving references to women and the temple is in the trials. Accusations of secret rituals sometimes mentioned interactions with women, often invented by inquisitors to paint a picture of corruption. In truth, the order's strict segregation and asceticism made such claims unlikely. Still, the Templar image, fierce, pure, and closed, invited speculation. And in later legend, women appeared more freely, as lovers, traitors, or guardians of secrets. These stories say more about imagination than history. But if we listen carefully, we can still hear their real voices, in the donation records, in the liturgies they sponsored, in the chapels built with their names carved in stone. Women did not fight under the Templar cross, but they helped shape the world in which it was raised. They gave land, gave sons, gave prayer. And though barred from the cloister, their shadow walked alongside the knights, quietly, faithfully, and often unseen. While the Knights Templar are remembered foremost for their martial discipline and religious fervor, their success also rested on something quieter, knowledge. Not the abstract learning of universities, but the applied wisdom of languages, law, architecture, medicine, and the art of governance. The rule of the temple emphasized simplicity and humility, but it did not forbid learning. Indeed, within the vast machinery of the order, spread across continents, commanding lands, leading men, a deep, functional knowledge was essential. The order did not seek to cultivate scholars, but they could not survive without skilled minds. Templars needed to read and write. In an age when many nobles were illiterate, the order maintained records, contracts, correspondence, and account books with remarkable precision. Scribes within the temple were trained to manage inventories, track donations, issue receipts, and communicate across vast distances. Letters moved between commanderies in England, Italy, the Levant, all in Latin, clear and formal. Their legal expertise was equally refined. The Templars operated under both canon and secular law. They negotiated treaties, resolved disputes, and defended their rights before courts. Their autonomy from bishops and lords required constant legal vigilance. They had their own internal courts, governed by the rule, and sometimes intervened in broader feudal or ecclesiastical conflicts. Architecture was another domain of expertise. From the great fortresses of the Holy Land to rural chapels in Europe, Templar construction was notable for its strength and function. They understood geometry, stonework, and engineering. In places like Chastel-Blanc and Safed, their castles were marvels of military design, walls layered for defense, towers positioned for visibility, gates angled for control. They also managed logistics on a continental scale. This required arithmetic, geography, and planning. They moved food, arms, and coin from one side of Christendom to the other, tracking cargo and coordinating storage. Their supply chains were as vital as their swords. In medicine, they followed the practices of the time: herbs, bloodletting, sanitation, but also benefited from contact with Islamic knowledge. In the East, Templars came into contact with Arabic texts and techniques. While they did not translate or disseminate science widely, they respected its uses. Some commanderies had infirmaries. Brothers trained in basic care tended wounds and managed disease. Languages, too, played a role. Latin was the official tongue, but in the East, Templars learned Arabic, Greek, and local dialects. Communication with allies, merchants, or prisoners required interpreters. Some brothers became fluent, serving as diplomats or guides. These were not scholarly linguists, but practical polyglots. Still, the order never aspired to be a center of philosophy or theology. That was the domain of the monasteries and universities. The Templars were men of the rule, of duty first, contemplation second. Yet their structure demanded intelligence. And it attracted it. Sons of nobility, trained in courtly arts, brought with them a foundation in rhetoric, scripture, and law. Veteran brothers trained the younger. Knowledge passed not only in books, but in habit, custom, and the silence of example. Thus, the temple became not just a military force, but an institution of competence, one that blended spiritual calling with worldly skill. In the hands of its brothers, the sword was sharp. But so too was the mind behind it. Though the Templars were founded as warriors against the Muslim world, their presence in the East was not defined solely by battle. Over nearly 2 centuries in the Levant, they engaged in a complex web of interactions, not only with enemies, but with neighbors, allies, and those who shared the land. At the frontiers of the Crusader states, survival demanded more than strength. It required diplomacy, adaptation, and a steady balance between confrontation and coexistence. With Muslim powers, the Templars fought often, at Hattin, at Gaza, at countless sieges and raids. They saw themselves as defenders of Christendom. Yet they also signed truces, exchanged prisoners, and at times negotiated peace. In these exchanges, respect emerged. Muslim chroniclers such as Usama ibn Munkid, while critical of Franks in general, occasionally described the Templars with grudging admiration, noting their bravery and discipline. In one account, Usama tells of a time he was allowed to pray in a Templar-controlled section of Jerusalem, the knights honoring his devotion. Such moments were rare, but telling. The Holy Land was not just a battlefield, it was a shared space of markets, paths, and walls. And even amid hostility, human gestures pierced the armor. The Templars also had to navigate relations with Eastern Christians. These communities, Greek Orthodox, Armenian, Syriac, and others, had lived in the Levant for centuries before the Crusades. They did not always welcome Latin knights, whose arrival brought war and disruption. Yet over time, the Templars learned to work alongside them. They protected Christian pilgrims, regardless of rite. They collaborated with local clergy. In Armenia, they forged alliances with native princes. At times, Templar castles hosted Eastern Christian refugees fleeing Muslim reprisals. Mutual interest softened theological division. Still, tensions existed. The Latin Church often looked upon Eastern Christians with suspicion, as heretical or schismatic. The Templars, bound by papal authority, shared some of these views. But on the ground, necessity moderated ideology. Coexistence was not a doctrine. It was a practice. In cities like Acre and Tyre, Templars lived side by side with merchants, Muslims under truce, Jews, and Christians of many traditions. They bought goods from Muslim traders. They paid local taxes. They walked through streets where 5 languages rang out. Their castles, while fortresses, also served as contact points, places where messages passed, hostages were held, and sometimes even alliances brokered. For though the Red Cross stood for unwavering faith, the men who bore it were not blind. They knew the land. They knew its people. And they knew that victory came not only from force, but from understanding. In this, their legacy is more nuanced than war alone. They were not only swords against Islam. They were also learners of its boundaries, neighbors of its cities, and, in quieter ways, participants in a shared history. Among the remnants of the Templar world, none are more haunting than the trial records. Preserved in parchment scattered across Europe, they bear the voices of men under pressure, men caught in the machinery of accusation, their words caught between duty and survival. When the arrests began in 1307, the inquisitors fanned out, not only in France but across the continent. Templars were seized in England, Aragon, Italy, and beyond. Though methods varied by region, in many places, especially France, interrogations were brutal. The charges were shocking: denial of Christ, spitting on the cross, worship of idols, indecent rituals, heresy concealed beneath vows of obedience. Most were fabrications, born of fear, ignorance, or royal manipulation. But in the cold cells of prisons, men confessed. Some did so under torture, their statements twisted and extracted through pain. Others confessed out of confusion or exhaustion, hoping for leniency. A few believed that acknowledging small sins might preserve the greater good of the order. And yet, among the many, some stood firm, denying all, even when they knew the cost. These voices, captured in Latin transcripts, reveal not just the facts, but the fear. Some are fragmented. Others are detailed. They speak of initiation rites, of the first moment a man took the cross. They recount the daily life of the order. They describe prayers, brotherhood, moments of doubt, and glimmers of defiance. A brother in Paris might say, "Yes, I was told to deny Christ, but I did not." Another in Poitiers, "I said the words, but I did not mean them." A Templar in Aragon, "There was nothing heretical. Only silence, and the taking of vows." And then, the silences. Many men gave no answer. Some refused to speak. A few died before they could be heard. The papal commissions, convened later, sought clarity. In Chinon, Pope Clement's envoys questioned senior leaders. The so-called Chinon parchment, discovered centuries later, revealed that they had granted absolution to de Molerie and others, accepting that their confessions had been coerced, that their faith remained intact. It is one of the few moments when justice flickered. But it came too late. The records reveal a bureaucracy both cold and confused. Some officials believed the charges. Others merely followed orders. And still others, years later, look back with regret. For in these testimonies, one sees not wickedness, but humanity. Men afraid. Men faithful. Men failing and resisting in equal measure. They do not speak in the voice of myth. They speak as men do, uncertain, grieving, and hoping their words might still mean something. Today, these parchments sit in archives. Faded ink. Worn pages. But in them lives the memory of hundreds of Templars, not as legends, but as brothers who bore witness to truth, to betrayal, and, for some, to the strength of silence. For centuries, the papacy appeared complicit in the destruction of the Knights Templar. Pope Clement V, the man who officially dissolved the order in 1312, was long viewed as weak, a pontiff who bowed to the will of Philip IV of France. Yet the deeper record, unearthed slowly over time, tells a more complex and tragic tale. At the heart of this reassessment lies a single document, the Knights parchment. Discovered in the Vatican archives in the early 21st century, this parchment had lain misfiled for centuries. When studied and translated, it revealed a stunning detail, that Pope Clement V, in 1308, had quietly absolved the senior Templar leadership of heresy. The hearing took place at the castle of Chinon, where 3 cardinals questioned Jacques de Molay, Geoffroy de Charny, and other high-ranking brothers. Under oath, the Templars admitted that they had, under pressure during initiation, performed certain irregular gestures, spitting near a cross, omitting holy names. But they insisted these were symbolic, not blasphemous, and that they remained true to the faith. The cardinals, acting on the Pope's behalf, believed them. They granted absolution, not for heresy, but for weakness under coercion. The brothers were reconciled with the Church, and the matter, at least spiritually, was closed. And yet, this resolution was never made public. Political pressure from France escalated. Philip IV demanded harsher judgment. Public opinion, stirred by rumors and spectacle, turned against the order. Clement, facing a rift with France and unsure of his authority, suppressed the Templars formally in 1312, not by condemning their beliefs, but by declaring the order's reputation irreparably damaged. This distinction mattered. He did not proclaim them heretics. He did not rule their faith false. He ended the order to preserve peace, to avoid greater scandal. In the language of the bull Vox in excelso, Clement stated that he acted not by definitive sentence, but by apostolic provision. It was, in effect, an administrative euthanasia. But for the brothers who had suffered, confessed, and burned, the nuance meant little. The world remembered only the silence. The Church, to many, had abandoned its own. The Chinon parchment changed that. Though discovered late, it reopened the record. It showed that Clement had tried, quietly, imperfectly, to seek truth. That he had listened. That he had believed, at least in part, in the innocence of those who bore the Red Cross. Historians now look upon Clement with greater sympathy. He was no hero, but neither was he a villain. He was a man caught in a storm, between a ruthless king and an endangered church. And like so many in the Templar story, he chose what seemed the lesser evil. The parchment he left behind does not erase the flames of March 1314. But it does offer a whisper that not all had turned away. That, behind the pageantry of power, conscience still stirred. The Knights Templar vanished long ago, their fortresses now ruins, their banners folded, their names weathered into stone. And yet, their presence endures, not in armies or orders, but in the memory of what they once were. Across time, their story has become a mirror, reflecting the questions each age asks of courage, power, and belief. In quiet churches across Europe, the Red Cross still lingers, carved into lintels, etched into tombs. Historians trace their footsteps with care, separating myth from fact. Archaeologists study their architecture, uncovering the discipline beneath the legend. Scholars translate their rule, finding not secrets, but a structure of life marked by faith and rigor. Their story has become layered. To some, they are symbols of resistance, men who stood against corruption, who suffered for truth. To others, they are warnings of power unbound, of alliances too close to kings. Still others see them through the lens of myth, as keepers of hidden knowledge, guardians of ancient lines. In popular culture, their image endures, cinematic, dramatic, mysterious. They have been recast as conspirators, protectors, immortals. These fictions, though far from the truth, speak to something lasting, a fascination with duty, silence, and the fall of something once thought unshakable. In the Church, the memory is quieter. There is no canonization, no feast day. But the Vatican now acknowledges the injustices of the trial, the errors of judgment. The Kainon parchment stands as a quiet monument, not of vindication, but of human frailty. In Freemasonry and other symbolic traditions, their names are invoked, not as literal heirs, but as expressions of continuity, that there might be honor in secrecy, order in discipline, strength in brotherhood. In Portugal, the legacy shines still in the Convent of Christ at Tomar. In London, the Temple Church remains active, its round nave echoing prayers once spoken in Latin by armored men. In museums and archives, fragments are preserved, swords, seals, scraps of cloth. Each tells a part of the story. But the true echo lies not in relics, nor in theories. It lies in the reminder that men can believe fiercely, live simply, and fall utterly, and yet still leave behind something worth remembering. The Templars were not perfect. They were shaped by their time, harsh, hierarchical, resolute. But they stood for something beyond themselves. They bore weight, spiritual, martial, and moral, with discipline rare in any age. And when they fell, they did so with dignity. From the hills of Jerusalem to the banks of the Seine, from Crusader zeal to modern myth, their journey remains one of the most compelling chapters in human history. Not because they were invincible, but because they were faithful, even to the end.